The sun burned on the white rocks of Capri. It was 26er, and the sea whispered ancient secrets through the limestone arches of Tiberius Villa. Somewhere in the shade, beyond the blue sky, and far from the marble of the Roman Senate, the most powerful man in the world lay surrounded not by advisers or warriors but by children trained to purr like animals. No heralds proclaimed his presence. No statues were being raised. No victories were being carved into stone, because this emperor, this man whom Augustus once called the pillar of the empire, had chosen to disappear. He had not died. He had transformed. From Rome, they said he had gone mad, that he had turned his back on the state, that the emperor had given up law for lust. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if Capri wasn't an escape? What if it was the real capital, the true throne not of an empire built on marble and legions, but one carved from the darker material of human flesh? This is not the story of Rome. This is the story of Tiberius, second emperor of the Roman Empire. A man born to lead, but allergic to public life. A man whose mind collapsed inward, who ruled with paper from an island where his body and the bodies of others became the site of imperial power. This is a story of exile, of shame, of obsession and control. And above all, this is a story of the body. Tiberius Claudius Nero was not meant to rule. Born in 42 BC to Livia Drusilla and Tiberius Claudius Nero, he was later adopted by Augustus, Rome's first emperor, after Livia divorced her husband to marry into power. As a boy, Tiberius was quiet, decisive, observant, but never warm. He was a man of discipline, a general of staggering competence. He spoke Greek like a philosopher and marched like a centurion. He was, in many ways, the kind of man Rome needed and hated, because Tiberius lacked the shine. He lacked the hunger. He did not charm crowds or bathe in glory. He did not tell jokes. He did not offer wine-drenched speeches to these masses. In short, he did not want to be Caesar. That made him dangerous. Augustus saw something else. Not a son, but a tool. Tiberius was forced into marriage with Julia, Augustus' daughter, a woman he loathed, whose orgies became famous in the very court meant to represent Roman virtue. He was called back from military campaigns he loved, dragged into Senate debates he found repulsive, and crowned a prince of a city whose gaze he feared more than any sword. He hated the theatre of politics. But there was one thing he hated more: the loss of control. Tiberius's reign began with blood. Augustus died in 14er. And Rome wept. The Senate, knowing little choice remained, affirmed Tiberius as princeps' first citizen. But Tiberius, always the actor of reluctance, refused the crown before accepting it. It was a game. Within the first years, dissenters disappeared. Praetorian spies whispered through the marble halls. Friends of Germanicus the Golden General and Tiberius adopted. Son began falling from balconies. Poison returned to Roman cups. The shadows thickened. But Tiberius himself was vanishing. Public appearances dwindled. He grew obsessed with dreams and portents, reading omens in the entrails of livestock and the arrangements of smoke. He detested crowds, began writing decrees from his countryside estate, and slowly pulled the empire's nerves inward toward him. In 26er, he left Rome entirely. He boarded a ship with a handful of slaves, doctors, astrologers, and mute boys, and set sail for the island of Capri. He would never return. To most Romans, Capri was paradise. A floating limestone throne rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea, dotted with olive trees, sea caves, and villas of the elite. It was the retreat of the poet, the mystic, the tired general. It was a place where even Jupiter might choose to rest. But in Tiberius's hands, paradise turned inward. He built 12 villas across the island, each dedicated to a different god, each with its own set of rituals. Villa Jovis, the largest, perched on a cliffside like a vulture's nest, became his palace of power. Its walls were lined with secret corridors. Its terraces looked down on a drop of nearly 1,000 feet where rumour said the emperor threw those who displeased him. This was not a palace. It was a cathedral of skin. It is here that we must abandon the idea of Tiberius as a mere emperor. For Capri was not just where he ruled, it was where he became. became what? A god? A monster? Or perhaps something simpler? A man who finally let go of pretending to be civilized. There is a detail in Suetonius' account of Tiberius that many overlook. He describes how the emperor trained children, little boys and girls, to swim in his pools and nibble at him underwater, like minnows. He notes the mechanical systems installed in the villa, how doors could be sealed silently, how sounds could be muted. There are mentions of costumes, of punishments, of medical staff trained not in healing, but in sustaining pleasure without harm. It's easy to dismiss this as slander. Roman historians were not above character assassination, but the frequency and precision of the stories from multiple sources suggests something deeper. This was not mere indulgence. This was ritual. Tiberius was not chasing pleasure. He was building a theology, a private religion where the body was both altar and sacrifice, where obedience replaced virtue, and where power was measured in how deeply one could be humiliated without breaking. Rome believed in gods who raped, transformed, and destroyed. Tiberius simply followed their example. Back in Rome, law had begun to dissolve. With the emperor absent, the Senate became ceremonial. Letters were read aloud bearing his signature, and no one dared question them. Secret police grew in number. Informants earned wealth. Trials were conducted in whispers, verdicts decided before guilt was established. In time, Rome learned that distance made tyranny more effective. Tiberius ruled from silence. He made absence itself a weapon. And Capri was not his weakness, it was his stronghold. Like a spider at the center of an invisible web, he moved armies with ink and killed senators with glances. But always, always, from the safety of flesh and stone. From the sanctum of his private empire. We do not remember Tiberius for his battles. Not for laws passed. Not for treaties signed. We remember him for the things that cannot be carved in marble. We remember the grotesque pools. The rooms where children prayed not to gods, but to a man. We remember the final truth of power, that the most absolute empire is not over land, but over the nerves, skin, fear, and surrender of another human being. Power is a paradox. For some, it manifests as brute force or dazzling spectacle. For Tiberius, it was the mastery of shame. His retreat to Capri was no flight, it was a strategic withdrawal into the only domain he could fully control, the body. But not his own alone. Emperor, forever haunted by his own insecurities and alienation, turned to a grim doctrine, to discipline others through shame, fear, and control of their most intimate selves. This discipline did not require armies. It required silence. In Villa Jovis, a strange order was maintained. A harem. A court. Not quite. It was a school. A laboratory. Children, adolescents, servants all were subject to a strict regimen of obedience and submission, but with one critical difference: their bodies were not their own. Suetonius tells us he taught the boys to swim, not for sport, but for ritual. Some say he marked those he favored, others say he exiled those who resisted to the sea's depths. This was a place where fear was woven into flesh, where the carving of submission left no scars visible to the public eye but bled endlessly beneath. The discipline was not just physical, it was psychological warfare on the self. Tiberius transformed acts that once might have been tender into ceremonies of terror. His private chambers were equipped with secret passages, echo chambers, and observation rooms where trusted physicians recorded sessions with clinical detachment. These gatherings were not about pleasure, but the assertion of power through humiliation. The emperor's presence was omnipresent but unseen, like a shadow suffocating the light. Each interaction, each forced submission, was a rehearsal in absolute obedience, a lesson in the hierarchy of flesh. What psychological forces conspire to transform a man into such a master of cruelty cloaked in flesh? Modern psychology would speculate: paranoia, the incessant fear that others plot to expose or betray. Compulsive control, the need to regulate every detail to stave off chaos. Narcissistic vulnerability, a grandiose self-image shadowed by profound insecurity. Sadistic gratification, the paradoxical pleasure derived from another's submission. Tiberius' mind was a cage of his own making where the keys were held by others. Screams muffled beneath the marble floors of Capri. Capri was paradoxical. It was sanctuary from the demands of the public and simultaneously a prison for those within the emperor's sphere. The island's natural isolation made escape nearly impossible. Legends speak of the emperor's darker impulses being unleashed in caves only accessible by swimming through treacherous waters. The famous Blue Grotto, Loma source of awe, was whispered in darker tones, a site of secret rites and confinement. The sea was both a barrier and a tomb. While Tiberius ruled in shadows, Rome slipped into turmoil. The Senate grew restless. The people whispered curses. The void left by the emperor's withdrawal was filled by power struggles and conspiracy. But for all the political chaos, one truth remained. Tiberius created a kingdom where the body was currency and shame was coin. He mastered a tyranny that was invisible, felt only in the tightening of muscles, the silencing of cries, the breaking of wills. And when he finally died alone, in silence his myth grew. The story of Tiberius challenges us to look beyond the traditional definitions of power. It asks, what happens when the human body becomes the battleground of empire? How does shame govern when laws fall silent? And a man's control over others' flesh become the greatest political act? In the story of Tiberius, the physical and political are inseparable. The emperor's exile was not just geography, it was a descent into a world where flesh dictated the fate of nations. In ancient Rome, the emperor was not merely a political figure, he was a living god, an incarnation of divine will on earth. But for Tiberius, this divinity was wrapped in flesh that was both temple and prison. Unlike Augustus, who embraced public spectacle and civic religion, Tiberius retreated into the mystical sanctuaries of flesh and secret rites. On Capri, the body itself became the locus of worship, a sacred site where power was both exercised and embodied. Tiberius fashioned himself a kind of high priest in a cult, where the rites were enacted not in grand temples, but in shadowed chambers and hidden pools. The rituals of submission, control, and even degradation became ceremonies, solemn and inescapable. Historians speak of secretive gatherings in villas with ornate frescoes depicting gods of fertility, chaos, and transformation, a pantheon that mirrored the fractured psyche of the emperor. Every forced act of obedience was a sacrament. Every silent scream was an offering. The boys and girls who lived on Capri were not merely subjects, they were symbols of this theological order. Some were trained to perform like oracles, singing hymns and praises. Others were kept in cruel disciplines, their bodies shaped into vessels of both suffering and devotion. Ancient sources whisper of the piscine pools where children would swim, and where the emperor's gaze was said to weigh heavier than the law. To resist was to risk becoming a sacrificial lamb. To acquiesce was to become a living icon of imperial divinity. This cult of the flesh was more than cruelty, it was a deliberate weapon of control, forged in fear and awe. Tiberius understood that fear alone could not sustain power, it needed to be wrapped in the sacred, the unknowable, the mystical. The emperor's regime transformed trauma into ritual, pain into worship. He created a system where his subjects internalized their own subjugation, believing that their suffering was not just punishment, but participation in a divine mystery. As years passed, Tiberius' paranoia grew not only political but theological. He saw conspiracies everywhere, whispers in the wind, shadows in the flickering torchlight. Some historians argue that the emperor believed himself chosen by the gods to purify Rome through fear and sacrifice, that his cruelty was an expression of divine wrath. His isolation intensified, his court shrinking to a small group of confidants who were both worshippers and victims. Rome, meanwhile, was left to its own devices. Without the emperor's presence, the public sphere decayed. Political institutions grew hollow. Morality became fluid, and the people grew restless. The Senate was powerless, the army obeyed only where coin was paid. Yet, in Capri, the emperor remained sovereign, a dark god ruling over flesh and shadow. Tiberius' life and reign embody a paradox. He was a god who hid from his worshippers, a ruler who wielded power through the most vulnerable and intimate parts of human existence. His body and the bodies he controlled were at once temple and prison, altar and sacrifice. In this paradox lies a profound truth about power, that it is inseparable from the physical. That to control the body is to control the soul. What does the cult of Tiberius tell us about humanity? That beneath the veneer of civilization lies a raw, often brutal struggle for control over bodies and minds. That power without transparency can mutate into ritualized terror. that gods can be made and unmade in the flesh of their devotees. As we ponder this ancient story, we must ask ourselves, how do we recognize when power slips from service into sacrifice? How do we safeguard the human body and spirit from becoming an altar to tyranny? Capri, with its steep cliffs and rocky shores, is a place of breathtaking beauty. Yet beneath its sunlit terraces and sparkling coves lies a geography as forbidding as any prison. Its natural isolation, the sea acting as both moat and wall, made it the perfect refuge for a man who wished to sever ties with the outside world while maintaining absolute control over those within. Tiberius understood this geography intimately. The island was both sanctuary and cage, a place where power could be wielded unchallenged, but where escape was nearly impossible. Villa Jovis and the other imperial villas were more than just luxurious residences. They were instruments of control, designed to enforce these emperor's will through architectural means. Secret passageways, soundproof chambers and hidden observation points allowed Tiberius to monitor his subjects continuously. Courtiers and servants lived in constant fear not just of the emperor's whims but of the spaces they occupied. Walls could conceal watchers, floors could carry whispers. The architecture was a silent accomplice in the exercise of power. The inhabitants of Tiberius Island Court were trapped in a paradoxical existence. They were both prisoner subject to brutal disciplines and humiliation, sand priests, participating in the dark rituals that sustained the emperor's reign. Children trained to perform and obey, adults who navigated the treacherous social hierarchies with caution, and physicians who balanced between healer and interrogator. Their lives were a daily negotiation between survival and submission. On Capri, silence was a language. Louder than any shout, it spoke of fear, complicity, and resignation. In the emperor's presence, voices were hushed, secrets were shared only in glances. The silence extended beyond words to the very bodies of the island's inhabitants, whose expressions were carefully guarded, their movements controlled. Silence was both protection and punishment, a way to conceal horrors and enforce obedience. Fear on Capri was not incidental, it was cultivated. Tiberius' reign thrived on the terror of unpredictable punishment. A glance of displeasure could lead to exile over cliffs. A whispered suspicion could result in lifelong imprisonment or death. Fear was the glue holding together a society frayed by paranoia and cruelty. It ensured loyalty not through love or respect but through the absence of choice. When Tiberius died in 37, Capri was left to decay. The villas fell silent, the gardens grew wild, the echoes of ritual faded. But the shadow he cast lingered. For centuries, the island remained a symbol of power's dark face, the place where an emperor became a tyrant, and where the body was both tool and victim. Capri's legacy is a cautionary tale about what happens when isolation breeds cruelty, and when silence hides the deepest abuses. The story of Capri challenges modern listeners to consider the cost of unchecked power and isolation. It asks, how does physical and social isolation warp those who wield power? In what ways does silence enable oppression? Can the horrors hidden behind closed doors ever be truly confronted? As we reflect on the island and its emperor, we must ask ourselves whether modern societies are immune to such shadows or whether they too harbour their own hidden caprice. As Tiberius retreated further into isolation on Capri, the seat of imperial power in Rome grew increasingly unstable. The emperor's absence was not simply physical, it was symbolic. Without his guiding hand, the political machinery began to sputter and grind. The Senate, once a body of influence and prestige, became a hollow echo chamber, its decrees mere shadows of authority. Power vacuums invite chaos. In the corridors of Rome's palaces, factions formed, some loyal to the memory of Augustus, others eager to seize influence in the emperor's absence. Whispers of conspiracy multiplied. Accusations flew like daggers. Fear, already thick on Capri, spread to the city's marble halls. No one knew whom to trust, and paranoia poisoned relationships between senators, generals, and courtiers. Tiberius had not officially abdicated control, but from afar, his influence was distant and unpredictable. Senators found themselves sidelined, their authority eroded. Many felt like puppets with frayed strings, dancing to a tune they could no longer hear. Important decisions stalled, crises were ignored or mishandled. Rome was a great empire in name, but its heart was faltering. Rome's legions, pillars of its power, also felt the strain. Without clear leadership, military commanders became increasingly autonomous. Some acted with loyalty to the empire. Others sought personal gain. The once disciplined and orderly army showed signs of fragmentation and unrest. External threats loomed as borders weakened, and internal disorder simmered. Among Rome's citizens, discontent grew. Economic hardships, rising taxes, and corruption bred resentment. Public morals decayed alongside political order. Tiberius' absence was seen by many as abandonment. He had turned away from his people to live in excess and secret rites, leaving Rome vulnerable and divided. Tiberius' reign exemplifies a chilling paradox, supreme power coupled with profound absence. He ruled not through presence and charisma, but through fear, silence, and control of distant mechanisms. The emperor's physical withdrawal from Rome was mirrored by a political withdrawal from responsibility. His reign became a warning that power unanchored by accountability and visibility will erode from within. Rome's political decay under Tiberius offers timeless lessons. It reminds us that leadership requires engagement, transparency, and trust. It warns that withdrawal, whether physical or emotional, creates spaces where fear and factionalism flourish. And it compels us to ask, how do modern leaders balance personal needs with public duty? What happens when those entrusted with power retreat behind walls of silence and secrecy? As the empire crumbled quietly, history watched, recording the unraveling of one of the greatest powers the world has known. As years passed on Capri, the man who had once ruled the greatest empire in the world grew increasingly consumed by shadows both real and imagined. Tiberius' mind, already retreating from the public sphere, began to spiral into deeper paranoia. Each whisper on the wind became a threat. Each shadow a conspiracy. No one was safe, not friends, not servants, not even those closest to him. Tiberius' paranoia was not mere fear, it was a system. He constructed elaborate networks of informants, spies and enforcers who reported every word, every glance, every gesture. The emperor believed betrayal lurked in every corner. He punished suspected traitors with exile, imprisonment, or death, often on scant evidence. This created a climate of terror that permeated Capri and Rome alike. Some historians argue that Tiberius used madness as a tool, a cloak to mask his ruthless consolidation of power. Feigning instability allowed him to silence opposition and manipulate his court. But the line between performance and reality blurred. Tiberius became a prisoner of his own mind, trapped by the fears he once wielded. As paranoia grew, Tiberius isolated himself further. He communicated with Rome only through letters, and rarely addressed the Senate in person. His health declined, both physically and mentally. He grew thin, pale, and frail, yet his will remained ironclad. Even as his body weakened, his grip on power tightened. In 37, Tiberius died quietly on Capri. No grand public funeral. No outpouring of grief. Just a hushed passing, as if the island itself breathed a sigh of relief. His legacy was as complicated as his reign, marked by competence and cruelty, brilliance and madness. Tiberius' final years illustrate the tragic cost of absolute power unchecked by humanity. His paranoia was both symptom and cause of a reign shrouded in fear and silence. He ruled a vast empire, yet was a prisoner of his own mind. His story warns of the dangers when power is wielded without compassion, transparency, or self-awareness. Long after Tiberius' death, the shadow of his reign lingered like a ghost over the empire he once ruled. Capri's villas crumbled, the secret rites faded, but the story of a man who ruled through fear and flesh became legend. His name became synonymous with tyranny born of isolation and obsession. Rome struggled to recover from the fractures of his rule. His successor, Caligula, inherited an empire scarred by paranoia and decay. The political structures Tiberius weakened continued to erode. Psychologically, his reign exposed the dangers of unchecked power feeding on fear and control. Tiberius' story blurs the line between the body politic and the human body. His exile on Capri is a metaphor for leadership detached from the people, ruling through the most primal and private means. It reveals how political power can be projected and maintained through control of flesh and fear. Today, Tiberius' story resonates beyond ancient Rome. It warns leaders and societies about the dangers of isolation, secrecy, and unchecked authority. It challenges us to consider, How do we balance privacy with accountability? What mechanisms prevent the concentration of power into a fortress of fear? How do we ensure that governance remains humane and transparent? Tiberius was a man who ruled an empire yet was imprisoned by his own body and mind. His life is a testament to the paradox of power. To rule others, one must first rule oneself. When that fails, even the greatest empire can crumble under the weight of its ruler's demons. As we close the story of Tiberius Caesar, we are reminded that history is more than dates and battles. It is the story of flesh and spirit, power and vulnerability, order and chaos. And in the tale of this shadowed emperor, we find a mirror reflecting the darkest possibilities of human nature and governance. Thank you for listening.